Turn to Genesis chapter 22. Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and Abram responded, Here I am. And he said, Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, of which I will tell you. Let me explain this. As you know from Genesis chapter 12, you know the promise was, Abraham, I'm going to give you a promise. And it includes land, it includes blessing, and it includes a seed. That is a son. In Genesis chapter 17, verse 19, God says, your seed, your son, will bear a son. All right, that's the promise. Now God comes along and says, Abraham, I want you to kill your son. And Abraham's scratching his head. Now, how is this consistent with the promise of God? If my son will have a son, how in the world is God going to accomplish this if I kill my son? You see, we have the dumb idea that Abraham is skipping up Mount Moriah, whistling songs. This is a wonderful day in my life. Absolutely not. This is real. This is painful. He was asked to take a knife and plunge it into the heart of his own son. And though he believed God would raise him from the dead, it didn't obliterate the pain, the confusion. Imagine this happening to you. But would you note Abraham's incredible response? Notice the text. Let's read verses 3 to 5. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey. Did you note that he rose early? If there was ever a day I would have wanted to sleep in, it would have been that one. But he rose early. He took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and he split wood for the burnt offering. And I imagined as I read this, wouldn't it have been nifty for Abraham to not split the wood for the sacrifice? Get up to the rocky part of Mount Moriah and say, oh, Lord, guess what I forgot? I forgot the wood. I guess we can't have the offering. But Abraham is actually preparing every detail so that this can take place. He split wood and arose, and he went to the place of which God had told him. Verse 4, on the 3rd day, Abraham raised his eyes, and he saw the place from a distance. And Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go yonder, and we will worship, and we will return to you. Would you turn to the book of Hebrews and chapter 11? Let's start with verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. It was he to whom it was said, In Isaac your descendants shall be called. Yet he considered that God is able to raise men even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type. The word is parabole, from which we get our word parable. That is, he is a type, he is an illustration of Jesus Christ being killed and being resurrected from the dead. Now, with this understood, let's go back to Genesis chapter 22 and try to discover where Jesus Christ is to be found. And I've come up with 3 major areas where we can see Jesus Christ. The first is in the symbols of death. Note verse 6. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. You have the symbols of death being wood, fire, and a knife. The wood. Now don't overlook the fact that Isaac was to be a burnt offering. Don't forget that all Abraham was to do was not just strike him with the knife. He was also to burn him as a burnt offering. The Old Testament teaches us that burnt offerings were for sin. So Isaac was to be offered up as an offering for sin, and he was laid on the wood. In fact, notice verse 9. Then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood. And he bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Wood is never mentioned in the Old Testament burnt offering passages, but it is emphasized here. In fact, it's mentioned 5 times. Interestingly enough, Isaac carries the wood up the hill, just as Christ, until he stumbled, carried the wood up the hill. And then he was laid on the altar on top of wood, just as Jesus Christ was laid on the wooden cross and nailed to it. I think we can see Christ in the wood, mentioned 5 times in this text. Another symbol was the knife to pierce Isaac with. And we know, of course, the Old Testament prophets would say that one day the Jews, Zechariah writes, will one day look on him whom they have pierced. He was pierced through with a spike in his hands and in his feet. There is also the symbol of the fire, which typifies throughout the entire Old and New Testament tribulation or judgment. The first time fire occurs is in Genesis, and it's chapter 19, verse 24, where it talks about fire coming down from heaven to burn up Sodom and Gomorrah. The last time it's mentioned is in Revelation chapter 21, verse 8, where it talks about those who've rejected the Lamb, rejected the sacrifice, are cast into the lake of fire, which burns forever. So fire here being a symbol of the wrath of God, as we know Christ endured the wrath of God as it was typified in fire. I want to show you something else where I see Christ. It is in the submission of Isaac. Let's back up to verse 7. And Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." And he said, "Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" And Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." Note this, so the two of them walked on together. That's a double positive in the Hebrew, which is meant for emphasis. It shows unity. Abraham didn't tie a rope around his son and say, "Come on, obey me." No, Isaac went along in obedience and submission to his father. Can you see Christ in that? It's a neon sign. Christ who said, "I came to do the will of" who? My Father. Even the death of the cross. Isaac portrays Christ in his submission. Verses 9 and 10. Let me read verse 9 and let's go on to verse 10 again. Then they came to the place which God had told them. And Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood. Notice now Abraham's a lot older than Isaac, but Isaac allows him to tie him up and put him on top of the altar. And I have a feeling that Isaac probably climbed up there on his own accord. I doubt Abraham, being old, was able to lift a 30-year-old son. Note the submission. And Abraham stretched out his hand and he took the knife to slay his son. And Isaac said, "Stop!" He never did. He might have closed his eyes. And I would imagine that Abraham was weeping. But he submitted to his father. There is another place where I see Jesus Christ in this text. It is seen in the prophetic announcement that is so beautiful from Abraham. Note verse 11. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." And he said, "Do not stretch out your hand against the lad and do nothing to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Then Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the place of his son. Here's the prophetic announcement. Abraham called the name of that place Jehovah Jireh, which is translated, "The Lord will provide." As it is said to this day, "In the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." It's future tense. This is the prophetic announcement of Abraham, who says, one day God will provide the lamb. He didn't here, he provided a ram. He will one day provide a lamb for the burnt offering. In John chapter 1, verse 29, John the Baptist saw Jesus Christ coming toward him. And you know what he said? He said, "Behold, look, the Lamb of God, which takes away the sin of the world." He's here. God had provided. One more from Genesis chapter 22 that's really a discovery of the development of history rather than from the text. And this is perhaps one of the most powerful. Mount Moriah is nothing more really than a ridge of hills. It would be a place where Solomon would later build his temple. It would be destroyed, but just a stone's throw from the temple and from the place where Isaac was offered would be a city that would be built called Jerusalem. By the time of Jesus Christ, that ridge of hills was no longer referred to as Moriah, but it had been given a slang Aramaic expression because of the way that one of the ridges was shaped. It was now called Golgotha, the place of the skull. It is something to recognize the fact that the place where Isaac was offered as a type of Christ, offered as a burnt offering for sin, as it were, would be the very place where Jesus Christ would hang from the cross. The burnt offering being given up as a sacrifice for the sins of the whole world. The prophetic statement of Abraham had indeed come true. God had provided the lamb.